Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbeau, former Director of Operations in New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 8 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbeau. In this episode, we'll speak with Peter Su from Hanover Bank and discuss banking issues not faced by any other legally operating company. But first, let's take a spin around some news. Ice cream company Ben & Jerry's used its 420 platform to team up with Last Prisoner Project on clemency and called on consumers not to forget the tens of thousands of people who will spend their 420 in prison for the same cannabis-related activity that many consumers engage in over the cannabis holiday. This is why they wrote in an announcement, the ice cream company and advocacy group are joining forces to urge governors to grant clemency for anyone still imprisoned for cannabis-related offenses. Last week, Kentucky Auditor Allison Ball announced that her office is investigating the Office of Medical Cannabis and its execution of the Kentucky Medical Cannabis Program. The state's medical cannabis business licensing lotteries just wrapped up a few months ago in December. My office has continued to receive complaints about how the Office of Medical Cannabis administered the lottery process for awarding medical cannabis business licenses, she said about the investigation. Kentuckians should have confidence that state offices operate with transparency and integrity, and my office is committed to ensuring those standards. In January of this year, Robert Koop, who was Delaware's first marijuana commissioner, stepped down. Just 4 months later, Governor Matt Meyer named his new pick, Joshua Sunderland, who now awaits Senate confirmation. He is a lawyer who has worked on cannabis issues in various states. His experience navigating complex regulatory systems and work across the cannabis industry make him uniquely qualified to launch Delaware's adult-use marijuana market quickly and correctly, said Meyer in the announcement. I wish you much luck, Mr. Sunderland. By comparison, for those of you who wondered, on June 10th of 2024, New York Governor Kathy Hochul named an acting executive director to lead New York's Office of Cannabis Management. As of this date, Governor Hochul has not nominated a permanent agency head. When it comes to grants for cannabis licensees, Minnesota's got more than most states. The Office of Cannabis Management rolled out its Can Renew grants in February, which will provide $1 million toward community restoration programs in its first year. Now, this week, the office is making available $2 million for a program called Can Grow that focuses on farmers. We recognize that financing and resources are critical for Minnesota farmers, says Jess Jackson, OCM's Director of Social Equity, in the announcement. Can Grow helps to increase access to ownership by ensuring underserved farmers get a fair share at entering the cannabis market. Washington Governor Bob Ferguson signed HB 1141, a bill that allows agricultural workers in the state's cannabis industry to unionize. This is about restoring dignity and justice to workers who have been ignored for too long, says State Representative Lillian Ortiz Self, the bill's sponsor. By recognizing the rights of agricultural cannabis workers to organize, we strengthen both the industry and the communities that sustain it. And again, for those of you who wondered, yes, farm workers in New York can unionize, as the state passed the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act in 2019, which allows these workers to collectively bargain. Finally, and staying in New York, just as last Thursday's New York State's Cannabis Control Board meeting got going, it was interrupted by an exasperated applicant awaiting license approval. After Board Chair Tremaine Wright welcomed attendees and turned to the day's agenda, which ranged from business license approvals to updates on sales and ongoing trade practice investigations, an audience member interjected. We have been patiently waiting for a year and a half, she said, in reference to the application window that closed in December 2023, creating what is now called the December queue. People are losing money. People have invested everything. They are putting their lives on hold. During public comments at the end of the meeting, applicants in that December queue promised lawsuits. We don't want this to be slow walked over the next 3 to 5 years. If that is the way you're going to do it, then our next public comments will be in court, the audience member said. Wright resumed the meeting, and the first item on the agenda was adult use license approvals. The board approved 93, bringing the total to 1,605. During the meeting, the board also approved 6 that's conditional adult use retail dispensary renewals and 46 license amendment requests and location changes. As always, thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. One more thing before getting to Peter Su. For those people who attended or streamed New York's Cannabis Control Board meeting last week, am I the only one bothered by the acting executive director's absence? This was the 11th board meeting since the executive director was put in place and the 4th that she's missed. Her first meeting was in June of 2024, the day after being named the temporary agency head. She made some nominal comments and said she liked to listen. She missed the July meeting and proved she liked to listen by attending, but not saying a word the following 2 meetings. I get that there's a lot more to the job than attending the Cannabis Control Board meetings, but I would urge attendance be a courtesy extended to the CCB and the public attending those once-a-month meetings. And now, here's the joint session conversation. I'd like to welcome Peter Su. Peter is a banking executive at Hanover Bank with over 20 years of experience across the banking and financial services spectrum. He has spearheaded 3 separate cannabis banking programs as team lead at commercial banks and has acted as a cannabis consultant to dozens of other financial institutions across the country. Peter is currently an advisory board member to C Trust and to the Cannabis Summit. Additionally, he writes about the cannabis industry for Rolling Stone on the Rolling Stone Cannabis Culture Council. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Herb. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. Now, how did you get into cannabis banking? Like, how is that a specialty?
I apologize in advance. I don't have a very fun answer. The reality is that the bank that I worked for at the time, B&B, which later became Dime, they said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing this cannabis banking thing," and I was like, "Okay, yeah." So I raised my hand for it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "I could do that."
Yeah, and I think it was one of the first banks to do that because I remember, early on looking to see what banks were possible for some of our licensees, and the Dime Savings Bank actually had a business card that said the cannabis team,
Yeah.
so that was really pretty impressive.
Yeah, I remember when we first started, let me see, that was 7, 8 years ago or so, which, looking back, that was crazy that we thought we could do this.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a funny story. I think we went into it with a lot of naivete, just, things we didn't know about the industry. So for example, we had very lofty like sales goals, revenue goals, deposit goals. And then once I started doing our research, and Herb, you've been around the block, 7, 8 years ago, how many cannabis licenses were in New York?
0. Well, actually, no, there were
10.
some, on the medical side.
There were 10. We had 10 prospects.
Right, right.
We just honestly didn't know that.
Right. So, I think this is going to be sort of a policy heavy discussion, right?
Okay.
So now, one of the difficulties or the main difficulties for licensees, right, is that cannabis on the federal level is a Schedule I substance.
Right.
So what does that mean and how does that impact the licensee's ability to do banking business?
Honestly, the same exact way. So Herb, if you owned a legal cannabis business here in the state of New York, what's stopping a federal agency from coming in here and shutting you down?
Right now, there's nothing.
Not much, right?
Right. I mean, there was a Justice Department memo, right,
Sure.
called the Cole Memo. Basically, the federal government was going to turn a blind eye to the legal activities that were going on in states, but the strength of that memo at this point is really unknown.
Yeah, so honestly, the same dynamic carries over into the banking realm. So what's stopping a federal agency from, shutting down a cannabis banking program,
Mm-hmm.
fining the bank, seizing a property, et cetera, et cetera? Again, not much.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think you and I can agree that it's probably highly improbable, but on paper, it's pretty binary,
I think it's becoming more probable, but
So I'm glad you framed it with, the Cole memo, turning a blind eye, et cetera, because that's essentially what happened in the banking realm as well. In 2014, FinCEN, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, released a set of guidance. It's cleverly named FinCEN 2014. And it is a copy and paste of the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo was rescinded, but the FinCEN 2014 has never really been referenced anywhere else, meaning it has not been rescinded. But the issue is a little bit of what you're saying. It doesn't actually, legalize it. It doesn't say it's okay. It kind of says, well, as long as these things are happening. So the Cole Memo priorities also carried over into banking. And they're saying as long as these things don't happen, we're going to turn a blind eye to it. The problem, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead here, is that you're familiar with the Cole Memo bullet points. Let's just take any one of them, for example, prevent the distribution to minors. Now, keep in mind, this is from the bank's perspective. So imagine you're a bank executive. I'm like, Herbie, this is your responsibility. You need to prevent the distribution of marijuana to minors. You need to ensure that your customers you're not banking someone that's distributing to minors. This is your responsibility as the bank. How would you do that?
Well, under the state law, right, and the state regulations, if you walk into a cannabis dispensary, there's a gentleman there, typically a gentleman, that is checking IDs and ensuring that customers that are entering at least have an ID that demonstrates they're over 21.
Yeah. Once again, your insight and your knowledge of the industry is shining through, because sometimes when I ask people this question, hypothetically, how would you do it? They don't have that quick of a smart response. In the early days.
I'm sorry, did I ruin it for?
No. That was the perfect answer. What happened is there was this evolution, right? So in the early days, most banks interpreted that very literally. So this is our responsibility now. What do we do, right? So for example, any number of answers could suffice. There's no real clear cut. It's kind of like how do you intend to do this? So for example, you might say, well, you go visit a store and you say, well, no one can walk in. Literally, you can't walk in without checking an ID. And that's something we can note down. You might, for example, point out that the POS systems are now sophisticated enough to prevent the sale without capturing ID information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But all of this points to a very simple fact, which is that it's a lot more work to bank cannabis.
And that's the difference. So assume, I have a cannabis dispensary license, and my brother has a liquor license, right? And it's from State Liquor Authority, and I own a cannabis dispensary. He owns a liquor store. So, like from a banking perspective, what are challenges that I might face that he won't face?
Yeah. So again, I think the evolution of cannabis banking here comes into play. So yeah, in the early days, because banks and credit unions took a very literal interpretation of FinCEN 2014, we were doing so much work above and beyond. So comparatively speaking, right, the liquor store versus the dispensary. Again, something you might appreciate. So we used to collect the entire application. The license application. In other words, what you filled out to the state of New York to get a cannabis license, we would actually collect that. Now, you've probably seen some of them. Some of those were 10,000 pages. So, first of all, who's going to read it, right? Who at the bank is going to read that? Do I understand what I'm reading? What am I doing with that data now that I've collected it? Because now I'm sort of responsible, right? Me as your bank, I have a privacy issue. I've got data security issues. And I
so you're taking on additional liability potentially.
Absolutely, yeah. So I say evolution because I think today a lot of that has gone away. Most folks are doing more closer to what you're saying, which is to say we point towards other parties that are in the process that has that responsibility. How am I making sure that they're not selling to minors? Because they're duly licensed by the state of New York, and New York's regs, and thus the OCM's inspectors, auditors, et cetera, are ensuring these factors. So today it's pretty close to what a typical liquor store, quote unquote banking might look like.
So today you're legally permitted to do pretty much the same things with a cannabis dispensary, a cannabis licensee. Doesn't have to necessarily be a dispensary, and any other business.
Well, again, it's a little bit gray, right? Because it's not so explicit. It's an implicit permission to bank cannabis, provided you follow these guidance. So we still have to, very carefully respect those FinCEN 2014 guidance,
Hmm.
which does put it above and beyond what a typical, to your point, liquor store might look like.
All right. Can you also explain the use of credit cards? 'Cause I've had people ask me this, right? They go in and they want to charge it to their Visa, Mastercard,
Yeah.
and they say, I'm sorry, you can't do that.
Yeah. Well, there's a few basic reasons why you can't do that, and of course, it all traces back to a very simple thing, which is that it's federally illegal, right?
Hmm.
Um, okay, so one, um, there is no way, there is no way to have a compliant terminal inside legal or otherwise. There's no way to put a credit card terminal inside a dispensary today. And the reason for that is something called an MCC, a merchant category code.
Mm.
So if you and I were to open a bodega or a deli or whatever, right, we can call an ISO, an independent sales organization. We say, hey, we're opening a deli. They do underwriting, they vet that we actually have a deli, et cetera, et cetera. They give us a terminal, and we're assigned an MCC based on the description of the business, pending their verification of such classification. Right. Literally, an MCC does not exist for cannabis. So the machines that you see inside these stores, and let's be honest, they exist. None of them are properly MCC'd, because it literally doesn't exist. Now, if you were, for those folks out there that immediately ran to Google and looked it up, yes, an MCC does exist for cannabis dispensaries. But right below that, it says where legal. In other words, they're talking about Canada. They're not talking about the US.
Oh, okay.
Right?
All right.
So how are there machines in dispensaries? And that applies to debit cards as well, because it's the same. It's the same rails, right? Well, MasterCard and Visa, which are the largest, credit card providers, the associations, they've come out very publicly, and very consistently saying, no, we won't do it. It's federally illegal. It's against the law. Blah blah blah. So how are people doing it? Well, they're miscoded. So miscoding, I mean, it does happen. The question is, how big of a deal is it, right? So say we own that deli, but our machine is coded as a restaurant. Well, I mean, we sell food. I mean, is it that far off? Maybe not, right? However, again, because the MCC does not exist for cannabis, the way that it is happening, by definition, then is bank fraud. So the question is, and then you might have seen recently, there was a lawsuit where someone actually, a terminal provider, merchant processor, Switch, and look, it's public information, which is why I'm saying the names, right? Switch actually sued the merchant in question. They're saying, no, this is you did this. And that's a fascinating case. And actually, I'm surprised that it hasn't made more news, because there exists a couple of possibilities.
And where is that case? What state?
In Arizona.
Okay.
In Arizona. Now, that's unprecedented, right? Because the machines that exist, whether it's the cashless ATMs, whether it's just the miscoded terminals, et cetera, by and large, it just happens. And to your point, there is a little bit of a turning of a blind eye to it, because if you don't allow it, then the entire system is going to only exist in cash. And that's not good for anybody either, right?
Right. Well, and that's my next question. As far as additional costs and security concerns, right, for most of these dispensaries, because they are so cash intensive.
Yeah, it's the funny thing about cash. Look, the U.S. dollar legal tender, right? There's nothing wrong with cash. We have a lot of restaurants locally, some prominent ones, right, that will actually prefer cash. They will penalize, well, not penalize, they'll upcharge you if you use a credit card. So in some cases, regular businesses, non-cannabis, fully legal, they will incentivize their consumers to use cash because it's better for the business, right? Rather than paying the fees, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
The problem with cash is exactly what you pointed out. The logistics of it, it's just expensive. Even if you're able to personally take it, drive it down to the bank, which most cannabis banks and or credit unions actually won't allow you to do. And that's an interesting feature about cannabis, by the way, like that a lot of the programs out there, I don't know if you know this, a lot of the programs, you can bank there, but you can't do certain, in some cases, some of the programs, you cannot walk into the branches. That's not one of my features. I'm just saying.
Don't they typically require a security service to come pick up?
But I'm saying at all, like you're completely prohibited. Like the Herb and Peter dispensary, we cannot walk into the branch to deposit a check, cash a check, et cetera, et cetera. It's an odd feature of cannabis banking. But yeah, when you talk about cash, the problem is the logistics of getting that cash from your store to the bank, paying the cost, taking the risk. Because look, God forbid, we drive 30 grand down to the branch in my car, and something happens. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now, how do these licensees manage, like employee payroll, for example, or their compensation? Because I've actually heard from bud tenders a couple very early on had their bank accounts frozen, like after they got their first checks.
Yeah, it happens. I still hear a lot of that. I think on the consumer side, so personal accounts, that's starting to go away. In the early days, I used to hear that all the time. Even just regular employees would say, "Oh, I got my account closed," but let me throw out a hypothetical at you. And again, you're a policy guy. You like this. So it's something like 75% of mortgages in this country are packaged up and sold to Fannie and Freddie, right? Which are in effect federal agencies. In fact, they're currently owned by a federal agency, right? Mm-hmm. Can you take, if my W-2, right, 100% of my income comes from a company, a business enterprise that is federally illegal, and I apply for a mortgage, right? Can you take that loan and sell it to Fannie and Freddie? It's a hypothetical question. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say no.
On paper, you would say no, probably, right? Now, it probably happens because I can't imagine that 400,000 people employed by the legal cannabis industry all own their houses free and clear. I would find that hard to believe. So it probably happens. But if you were to go through that standard mortgage application, which most banks use, there is a question that I hereby attest that, I abide by all local, county, federal law. So how do payrolls work, right? Well, in the early days, that was a huge problem. People used to have to pay 100% of the cash, 100% of the income for the business was cash, right? Or at least like 90%. Today, I think that's heavily shifted. I see more like 70-30, 80-20, meaning less cash. Most folks have terminals. Most folks are taking cashless ATM or they have ATMs in the store. So we're seeing far less cash now than there used to be. Thus, the employees are being paid like normal. They're getting ACHs. They have benefits. I mean, it's a big difference. Yeah.
Now, what's the sort of distinction with, as opposed to federally chartered banks with state chartered institutions like credit unions?
Actually, nowadays the difference is very slim. It used to be, there were all these different categories, right? Savings and loans, credit unions, state charter, federal charter. Today, the distinction is very blurred. In fact, a state charter bank can do business in other states. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be, once you wanted to once you wanted to expand beyond your state, you had to get a federal charter. Nowadays, really only the largest, you see most of the largest banks, you'll see that NA, National Association, after the name, Citibank NA, Chase NA. Those are the federally chartered ones. But there's actually very little distinction between the two. But relative to cannabis, suddenly became significant again because not that you couldn't, but like let's say Hanover Bank, so we're state chartered. So the state of New York has legalized cannabis. The state of New York issues the bank its charter. we feel pretty good about the
Mhm.
fact that like we're not doing anything that our regulators are going to have a problem with.
Mhm.
But if the federal government issues you your charter, would you necessarily feel like as an institution that you would take the chance of banking something that the federal government does not condone
Mhm.
per se?
Right.
Again, you logically nothing prohibits you from using the same argument that we make, which is, hey, we're following FinCEN guidance. And in fact, if you were to talk to the regulators, that's basically what they would say, right? You've seen a lot of the regulators opine on this publicly. The NCUA is very vocally, I'm sorry, the NCUA is the National Credit Union Administration.
Mhm.
Um, and they've been much more vocally supportive of banking cannabis, but they always say the same thing, FinCEN guidance, FinCEN guidance. So if I was federally chartered, could I make the same argument? Sure. Would the institution take that chance? That's hard to say. I mean, we've not seen that. So
Now let's switch a little bit to talk about the Safe Banking Act and 280E, right, the Internal Revenue Code.
yeah.
So how does the fact that cannabis remains federally illegal impact a company's, financial situation from a tax perspective?
Sure, let's tackle 280E first then.
Okay.
So I realize you're asking me this even though you know the answer, but for your audience, 280 is very simple to think this is I jokingly say this is one of those only in America kind of things, right? So it turns out
Well, there's a lot more things that are only in America now.
we have this code, IRC 280E. If your business is engaged in the trafficking, and I'm doing air quotes for anybody listening to just the audio, of a Schedule 1 drug, you can only deduct costs of goods sold.
Mhm.
Now, it kind of makes me think it's ridiculous and laughable because if you're trafficking a Schedule 1 drug, you would think like, well, why would I be filing a tax return, right? But apparently somebody did that, like back in the 80s, somebody was selling cocaine and file taxes and made arguments. And so, of course, some outraged politician created IRC 280E, which wasn't really a factor, right? Because who else would have done such a crazy thing until legal cannabis?
Mhm.
And guess what? You are trafficking a Schedule 1 drug.
Right.
Thus, you can only deduct cost of goods sold. So what does that mean? So your business, you sell a pre-roll for $100. It costs you $50 to make it. Other businesses can deduct all kinds of stuff, right? Like rent, furniture, et cetera, et cetera. You cannot.
Mhm.
So the effective impact on your taxes, on the bottom line, what you actually pay versus your top line number, is a huge difference. In just as a random example, in like 2023, Amazon's effective tax rate was calculated at around 5%. Your typical cannabis business effective tax rate in the 50-60% range.
Oh, it's amazing. Now, New York State itself tried to address some of this discrepancy.
Yeah, so certain states, New York, to your point, being one of them, decided to, divorce from IRC 280E. That gets a little bit too complicated for my abilities to explain, but yeah, it helps you out,
Hmm.
because because the state code is obviously divergent from the federal code.
Hmm.
But yeah, like the bottom line to take away is that running a cannabis business relative to say that liquor store that you mentioned, you're just less profitable. Even if you both make the same amount of money, your cannabis business is less profitable.
Right.
Now, granted, your top line might be much better. And Herb, you saw the recent those like top stores in New York. I mean, our top stores in the state of New York, 1 year, well, 2 years into like a functional market, our top stores are the top stores in the country. Like these are
Hmm.
some of the top stores in the country, in a very young market. So, if is there a point where you kind of say, you know what, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Like whether I'm paying 30% on 10 million or 30% on 7 million, like, you're doing very well. But at some point, yeah, like as we bring on more licensees, you'll certainly see that market get diluted.
All right. So we'll go back to the Safe Act, right? Which
Yeah.
is there was a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of discussion over the number of years. Last year was probably the closest people felt we were getting to enactment,
Yeah.
passage of the SAFE Act, but that has died down. Can you talk a little bit about what the SAFE Act would do?
Well, the interesting thing about the safe, now it's called safer. And of course, I like to joke that I'm waiting for safest. Um, the funny thing
The
about
Goldilocks need to be.
so there's a couple things to keep in mind, right? You already heard me say FinCEN 2014,
Mm-hmm.
which means it came out in 2014, right? So here we are, 2025. It's 11 years later. It's actually like less than 11, but 11 years later. Well, the SAFE Act was first introduced about 10 years ago, right? About the same time that FinCEN 2014 was released. The funny thing about SAFE is that it kind of happened. That the world that SAFE Act wanted to create, it kind of just happened because of FinCEN 2014.
Mm.
Meaning, depository services, right? Like, are cannabis businesses banking today? Yes. Yes. In fact, I'm going to tell you that, and I don't know if this is a surprise to you, but I find that the opposite is true. For all the headlines that it gets about cannabis banking, oh, we can't, cannabis businesses saying we can't get banking, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I run a cannabis banking program for Hanover Bank. Almost every situation I get into where I'm engaged with a prospect, I'm in a competitive situation.
Very good.
Meaning, it's not just, oh, thank God you're going to take my account. No, they're saying like, how much do you charge? What are your services? Oh, so-and-so is offering me a better deal. Are you willing to extend financing? Things like that. So, I mean, the SAFE Act, at this point, it's gone through the House, 8 times now. The question is, what is its effectiveness today if it were to pass? I think from a bank, now banking is one of those terms that can mean lots of different things, right? From a depository perspective, I'm not sure that it does much, because the reality is today,
Mm-hmm.
a cannabis business that wants an account can get an account, period.
Well, and that's still a dramatic leap from where we were 2 or 3 years ago.
Definitely. I think today the discussions are really around capability, capacity, and costs. So in other words, you can get an account, but are you happy with the services that it provides? Are you happy with the costs? And the cost is a major factor, which is, I set the stage with that earlier when I talked about like what the bank has to do. So can the SAFE Act and the SAFER Act change that, right? Change that dynamic, make it less costly. That could be a major difference. Can it add things like credit cards, maybe change some of the lending considerations, right? If it does things like that, then sure, that's effective, it's impactful. But if it just means, now you can open a bank account, I'm going to tell you, like, you can open an account today.
Yeah, terrific. And I don't think people realize when we talk about bank accounts being closed a few years ago, even today, I still hear licensees getting closed down on Instagram, right?
Yeah.
Facebook,
Yeah.
which is really incredible. But all right, Peter, thank you so much for your time today. I want to tell people, if you're not following Peter Su on LinkedIn, and I sort of talk about LinkedIn every now and then, but Peter we have, I think, a really pretty interesting community going on LinkedIn. Very supportive people. Very
So strange, right? Like, of all places.
right. It really is. It's supportive. It's information filled. It's very funny. Peter contributes to a lot of the humor on that community. So I'd like to thank you for that.
Thanks.
Any last words for anyone interested in looking for banking services in New York State?
Oh, New York, the OCM did a great thing recently. They rolled out that banking directory. Definitely check that out. That there's lots of great local banks that want to do business with you, and myself included. I think the next frontier, right? The lending, the extra services, that's the real next battle. And I welcome calls. I'm happy to be a service and resource.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter Su from Hanover Bank. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session: Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbeau, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from SimLab Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbeau. Thanks for listening.